The federal government will turn over thousands of records to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. These are residential school records, and today's announcement comes after a year of discoveries at former residential school sites. Hundreds of unmarked graves discovered. Stephanie Scott is the executive director of the NCTR.
This is an important step on the journey of reconciliation. It is a step that is frankly long overdue.
Marc Miller is the Minister of Crown-Indigenous Relations. He's in Ottawa. Well, Minister Miller, certainly what you announced today is a big step forward. But as we look forward, the agreement is to share residential school documents, but not all of them. So we just want to let Canadians know and give some clarity on why you are not releasing all of them. What specifically is keeping you from doing that at this point?
Yeah, and I think that there needs to be a clear understanding of what all of them actually means. There are now 11 school narratives spanning thousands of documents that will enable survivors to achieve some measure of closure by that disclosure that had been held up to now and shouldn't have been so. That is being disclosed through this process with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, including documents in and around Kamloops. There are about 4 school narratives, Lac La Biche, Lesser Slave Lake, St. Augustine, and St. Joseph's, for which there was no narrative created. People need to understand what a narrative is. It's not only school records or sketches of the school. It can be complete documentation, which is in various levels of preparedness. Those 4 schools never had any narrative with respect to them. There is also another category of documents that the Supreme Court has clearly said benefit from absolute confidentiality, which is the testimony of individual survivors through the independent claims process of residential schools. And indeed, the Supreme Court has ordered that those documents in the next few years be destroyed. That is something that we have a lot of hesitation towards, and people can imagine why, but that is in the spirit in which that information was disclosed as part of the compensation process. So that is stuff that we are beholden and we are held to survivors to retain as part of a legal process. But there's also a question here in who the decider is as to what gets disclosed and what does not get disclosed. We feel that in our process with the NCTR is best suited to be the arbiter of the information, which clearly shouldn't be held by Canada. But there's also a process that we need to examine internally as to how we use our legal instruments and what we disclose to as part of documenting this history and the effect that it currently still has on survivors and those suffering from intergenerational trauma. So we're talking about a large category of documents, sometimes clearly understood, sometimes less clearly understood. But we're doing it in a spirit of transparency, focusing less on our legal obligations and more on our moral duties to survivors.
So can we expect more documents will be released as you sort through them and get through the issues that you were just mentioning?
Yeah, it's an excellent, pertinent question. There will be an evolving process with the NCTR as they triage the documents, as they are rendered in a more accessible form, less corrupted than previously provided. But there will also certainly be an examination internally as to how we invoke our legal rights, how we exercise them, with a focus on trying to help survivivors. So the answer to that is yes.
I just want to dig into a few of the terms you used. Obviously, we know the meaning of these words, but in this context, I'm wondering if you can break them down a little bit. When you say some areas, some locations didn't have narratives around them, describe what you mean by that.
So a narrative, for example, around the school would depend on the number of documents that were provided and are still obtainable. So depending on the length of operation, the volume of the documents that were obtained,
the history of the school, the people who went there.
Well, it can be history of the school. It can be handwritten documents. It can be school rolls. Some of these have been lost throughout time. They are in various states of readiness and readability. Some are quite complete and some not. So in respect of 4 schools in particular where no narrative was created, those narratives were created largely in the context of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the IR and the lawsuit on residential schools, and they were correspondingly, according to our obligations, turned over largely to the NCTR. There were documents that were being withheld, and those are the ones that are in great part being turned over today.
And when you use the word corrupted to describe some of the documentation, describe what you mean by that. What states are there?
Yeah,
what might have happened to them?
Unreadable formats provided that were unclear, copies that were less accessible. We are working, and this is the important aspect of some of the work that we're doing at the NCTR, that information contained in the documents needs to be accessible in sort of a state-of-the-art form, which is readable formats for perhaps handwriting. That is a work that needs to be ongoing with the NCTR, so people can actually search for terms, search for names, and not simply have, what I had to deal with as a student, which is sort of film and such. It just makes it very unuser friendly. And so just trying to help the NCTR and have the tools that they can have to have these documents in a more readable, less corrupt form is one of the complaints that they had, and very legitimate towards our production of documents. And it's something that we're moving to remedy. And in that context, there's about 875,000 documents of varying nature that will be provided and turned over in a more readable format to the NCTR.
You're not the only one who remembers microfiche at the library looking up documents. But just to turn back to our discussion, obviously, the legal challenges, the possibility of legal challenges you mentioned from third parties, the Catholic Church, for example, and you also said that that's something Canada, not survivors, should have to deal with. So how are you preparing for that possibility? Is there money set aside?
Well, in any process where there could be a third party that will hold Canada liable for undertakings, we prepare for it, obviously. But again, the position we were taking, and we were sitting back and saying, we're not going to withhold these because we don't have the necessary consent. Now, I wouldn't paint that as a black and white scenario. The various Catholic institutions in the meantime have been acting mostly in a progressive fashion to move forward and disclose themselves the documents, or to give us the permission to do so. So there's a fluid dynamic. But at the end of the day, we didn't want to be in a situation where we were resting on a third-party consent and survivors were still looking for closure. Any piece of information can help with that process. And I think it's up to Canada to take that risk pursuant to its moral duty.
It's more than symbolic, what you've done today and what you still plan to do. How do you hope these will help in potential identification processes in Kamloops and other sites across this country?
Well, it's very difficult for someone like me who's never experienced this or ever had anyone close to me go through this process. But I have heard a lot of testimonial from survivors, and every piece of information counts. I've heard poignant stories in a similar context about a woman who hadn't forgiven her estranged husband for the death of their child, and simply finding out the death place and date, not bringing obviously the child home, does provide a measure of closure and allowed her to forgive, or at least start to forgive her estranged husband for the death of the child. And these are stories that multiply over time. They are very painful to hear, but it is indicative of the fact that any piece of information can help, as small as it may appear on the surface to people looking in from the outside. So the last 6 months has shaken the government. There's no question about that. And it has really refocused our view, and it's part of the work the Prime Minister asked me to do, which is to leave no stone unturned, and I don't intend to deviate from that.
Stephanie Scott, the Executive Director of the NCTR, says she hopes that the spring budget will have funding for a new building to archive and share documents. You've said you intend to honor that promise. Can we expect that it will be in this year's budget? And if that's the case, how much money?
I think we did I personally made that announcement in Winnipeg during the campaign. Our government intends to honor it. I obviously, you can appreciate I can't speak to any particular budgetary item for the next budget, but it's something that we remain steadfast in our engagement to fund, and the Prime Minister has said as much, or alluded to as much, in his year-end interviews. So I think we can look forward to some positive announcement soon.
Minister Miller, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.